Good evening. You're on the smoking section, or you're watching it, and tonight I have a good friend, I would say. We've known each other for probably since about 1987, I think, which is 30 years.
God, yes. Oh.
You know, when we were involved in some zoning issues in the good old days, you know, when Cambridge was changing, and now it's changed. And
It's still changing.
is it really changing every moment? I don't even know what that is, but that's probably some art
It's going to
installation.
be 20 stories high when it's done.
Oh, that God, you can't be serious, really? 20 stories? Well, I think. Well, Bill, you know, we really fought the Cambridge Housing Authority. I think we put up a good fight, if I do say so myself.
Yes, and now, of course, as of 2 months from now, all housing authorities throughout the country are obliged to have this smoking policy.
Is it so? Is that July 1st?
I believe the first, yes.
And is that something? Well, I mean, do all housing developments are they under control of the Department of Housing and Urban Development?
Well, if they want any money from HUD,
Yes.
they have to comply. Of course, there's a state housing program too, and if the housing authority in Massachusetts, for example, only has state housing and no federal, then it's not going to affect them.
Are there any such developments
Yes.
to your knowledge? Oh, there
There are a lot of housing authorities in Massachusetts, and some of the small ones don't have any federal housing.
So they are not obliged. Now, and that would go the same for, I assume, Section 8 housing.
No, it doesn't apply to so-called mixed income housing, which they really mean Section 8. So, no, it only applies to the public housing developments.
Right.
And technically, even though the public housing program per se is coming to an end in Cambridge and being replaced by the RAD program, which technically isn't public housing.
Yes.
And they're not going to be getting very much from HUD, but they've already done it anyway.
Yes.
And this is, you know, it's just ironic. We fought this, and you see the comments that were sent in to HUD when they were asking for public comment on their policy. They're very similar to the same kind of comments that were in Cambridge.
Right.
Of course, they brushed them off in the same way.
Right.
So.
Let me ask you I don't know, was it a couple of months ago, I think, there was some administrator with Cambridge Housing Authority, and I think I read it in the Chronicle.
Or the Day.
Yeah, maybe I read it in the Day. I probably read it in the Day.
Because they have somebody who writes for the Day who goes to all the public housing board meetings.
And, oh really? And evidently one high administrator said that there were certain elements of the non-smoking or of the smoking ban that needed some adjustment or could use some adjustment.
Well, he was a little more brusque than that. That was Dean Petruzzi, who was for a year the head of the operations department, which basically oversees management of the public housing development.
Right.
And he actually stated, well, the policy is a failure.
Well, I'm glad to hear that it's a failure,
But,
yes.
of course, it's not clear, it depends on what you mean. He never stated what the purpose of the policy was, and I'm not sure that he knew what the purpose was, but he regarded it as a failure because he didn't hear anything coming up from, there weren't cases coming to him, there weren't issues that were arriving at his desk. He heard of only 2 in the whole year that he was there, where anybody had complained one way or another.
Right.
So that's how he also did note some of the same things we did, which was, it's just not realistic to ask an 85-year-old woman who's been smoking all of her life to go out in the cold and the dark 20 times a day.
Well, it's realistic, but it's, I don't know what the word to use is. I mean, it's almost sadistic.
It's real, no, it's not realistic because the woman's not going to do it, and nobody's going to complain about her not doing it either.
Well, I
So
mean,
therefore, if the purpose is to get people to stop smoking and not have anyone smoking in the building, it's not going to work because the housing authority did not take account of the human factor. Not only this potential sadism of making somebody do this, but the neighbor's solidarity in understanding that the person shouldn't have to do this.
well, I mean, there was a case in Connecticut where a 90-year-old was. Are you familiar with that case?
Those cases are almost all in actually private housing, which has Section 8s in them.
Yeah.
The guy that runs HUD now,
Yes.
actually, I'm glad he doesn't really understand the programs, because if he lets things alone, it's probably not as bad. But he doesn't know the difference between public housing and the Section 8 program himself.
Right.
Because he got stuck in an elevator in a building once and he thought it was public housing, but it wasn't. So the cases, they're more harsh in some of these mixed buildings than they are in public housing.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. And
Well, it's, in one way you're glad to hear that.
what?
For the sake of the people in public housing,
Right.
it's good, but not for those that are in these buildings that are even market buildings where smoking is out of bounds. They evict people.
Now, what about, let's say, for example, 411 Franklin Street?
Well, that's a kind. I don't know. The manager who was there for many years, people liked her. I don't know if she's still there, and I don't know what they're doing, but that's the kind of building where it could be a harsher.
Mixed policy. Well, I'm glad the people in public housing are, not being evicted and, well, I mean, as you mentioned, Bill, at the meetings, you asked the authority if they had records of complaints, and they didn't have any records.
No, they came up. The director of operations at the time finally said, "Oh yes, we have 10 or 20." Well, it's one of those things. Yes, well, where are they? Do you have any records? No, it's always been clear to me that they were moving on the initiative of HUD rather than on their own or because of any complaints that were coming to them.
And HUD was moving, I guess, simply because, for whatever reason, the federal government and state government wants to eliminate smoking.
The feds, in this case, in particular, yes, right. And as you know that the recommendation came down from HUD in 2009. They strongly recommended.
Yes.
So, Cambridge Housing Authority is a moving to work housing authority, and it's supposed to be a high-performing housing authority to be able to get this status, moving to work.
Moving to work. I don't even know what that means.
Never mind what it all that it means. The most important thing that it meant for them is that they could move their money around between the state and federal.
Yeah, right.
They could do things like that if they were moving to work, because they didn't have to go by the strict regulations that HUD. They make their own regulations, right?
You mean vis-a-vis money?
Not just money.
I see.
There's only 20 or 30 in the whole country that were moving to work out of 3,000 housing
Oh my
authorities.
gosh!
So
Right.
to maintain this with the program coming up for renewal in a couple of years, I strongly think that one of their motivations was to remain a high-performing housing authority. You take the recommendations of HUD and run with them. You don't wait for them to become
curry
mandatory.
favor. To curry favor.
Yes, yes. I think that's part of it. Otherwise, what's the reason why they didn't do anything all these years? Well,
Well, first of all, they didn't get complaints.
No, but they didn't get complaints this time either.
Right, but they were currying favor with HUD.
You could call it that. Yes.
And HUD was acting, I guess, because I mean the anti-smoking establishment is so strong and so global that it really. It's as we both know, it's very, very
Well,
powerful.
it's a group of people who know where to put pressure on, and they do. And they're in Washington, and that's where all these regulations get written up. But it's important. This is interesting because Professor Vail over at MIT written a few books on public housing and history of public housing. And one of his books is is about how public housing and any housing that has had anything to do with the public sector in the past.
Yes.
Always been something that's been used for experimental stuff. You know, the government's always
Oh, I see.
it's put
Right.
the reforms through. Oh, we own this housing, so we can reform people's lives, right?
Yeah.
We can do this and we can do that, and you know, they're contradictory policies. They come and go, but the basic thing is, well, you own this housing, so you're obliged to act like a really responsible government landlord and make people's lives better by telling them what to do.
You're at their mercy. You're at their
Yeah.
mercy.
And yes, you are, and you sign in to this when you become a public housing resident. You sign this big long document.
Well, I mean, of course, you know, the banning smoking now has spread to high-priced condominiums and other.
Well, it started in them. It didn't start in public housing. It started in private housing.
Probably, but I mean, for example, New York City, I'm not perfectly clear on this. I think New York City there's a very active smokers' rights woman in New York named Audrey Silk, and she has a Facebook page. I think New York City, which has been, you know, under Bloomberg, was the most anti-smoking, probably, metropolis in the world. I think they now require all buildings over a certain size. I would assume that if you have a...
New ones, you mean?
No, I don't. I think right now, New York City requires all buildings over a certain size. So I assume if you own a two-family house in Queens, you don't have to do it. But if you own a building that, say, has 10 apartments in it, that you must file with the city or with the Department of Public Health a smoking policy.
Uh-huh.
So you can't just not have a smoking policy.
But you could have a smoking policy that says people can smoke.
Right, but I think everybody who's going to file a smoking policy, this is a way of, I don't know about forcing landlords, but certainly putting pressure on landlords to prohibit smoking in people's apartments.
It's interesting, you know, that you probably know this already, that in Japan, smoking bans are the opposite of here. In Japan, you can smoke inside your house anywhere,
Yeah.
but you can't smoke on the street. In many cities, they don't allow you to smoke outside, only inside.
Right.
Here
Well,
it's the other way around.
Bill, I don't know if that, you know, if it's nowhere in the city. I think there are areas of the city you may not be able to smoke, or you may only be able to smoke in certain areas. I don't.
All I'm saying is that the prohibitions are based on outside, not inside. Inside they don't prohibit, outside they do.
Right.
Of course, there are cities where they don't. I know, so there might be places in Tokyo that it doesn't apply, but it's a city policy. That's what I understand.
Really?
But it's just odd, you know, why is it different? What's the so-called science behind doing it one way in one country and another way in another country?
Do you think there is really any science, or do you think it's all...
Well, science is largely ideology anyway, so I'm sure there is science.
Really? Yes. Yeah.
Of
Well,
course there's science, there's always science.
I mean, I think Japan still has a very high rate of smoking. They always
Yes.
did.
Yes.
And of course, I always like to point out a very low rate of heart disease, lung cancer, and what is the other thing that's associated with heart disease, lung, and a very high, I mean, they still have a very high life expectancy, perhaps the highest of the industrial world.
Pretty high, yes. Yeah, things are changing there, but you could attribute it to the food until you realize that they'll eat almost anything, so I'm not sure. It's interesting. It is true that all over East Asia, cancers and heart diseases and so on are much rarer than here.
Despite
And
their
they
much
smoke
higher
like
rates of
fiends.
smoking.
Yeah, they smoke like crazy. Yeah.
But, oh, Bill, you brought this document. Now,
I didn't bring it for the show. I brought it because I thought you might not have seen it.
well, it's quite possible I didn't.
And it gives all the points, like A through I, of what our committee came up with, working with the legal aid people about what our objections were. And then it goes next section, well, if you do it, then what other ways are there to deal with this issue? And then if you go ahead with this policy, what are we gonna do to mitigate it? It's all in, you know, how lawyers are. They'll argue, you know,
And this
I
was
didn't
written,
do it, but if I did, it
Right.
was his fault.
and this was written by whom? Oh,
Well, it was written up by, there are 3 signatures, actually, so they probably all actually wrote on it. We all looked at it, though.
right.
Ellen Schachter and Susan Hagel from Castles and Cheryl Ann from ACT.
What is Castles?
Cambridge and Somerville Legal Services. It's
Oh,
the main
really?
legal
Oh, I
service.
see,
It's
yes.
the main legal service operation. Susan was the one that first alerted us to the spread of these policies, you know, back in, before the HUD memo came out in 2009, that they were beginning to get stuff from legal services people in other parts of the country saying, you know, what are you going to do about this? You know, nobody seems to have done any lawsuits on it or anything. So.
Well, I mean, you know, I don't see any legal remedy because, you know, under the Fair Housing Act, I mean, as a, you know, you as a smoker, you really, according to, you don't have any rights, essentially.
Not as a smoker, but as a tenant.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you're not, no, you know, they point out over and over again, in order to have smokers' rights legally, that the category smoker has to be defined in law, and it's difficult to have a protected category, which is something that people can become and then not become. So,
Yeah.
protected categories are usually ethnic or gender or something.
Or
that
disability,
doesn't
that's
change
usually a
easily, or
permanent disability,
right.
right.
So the idea of smokers' liberties, as in civil rights versus civil liberties, it's a liberty, not a right.
Yes,
And
right,
so-
very good point. Someone I know constantly reminds me of that.
Constantly. Oh well. I
Well, it's a
wouldn't
good
wanna be around
idea.
somebody
It's a
like
good
that.
idea. Liberty rather than right.
It's a liberty rather than a right. So are we going to say that liberties don't count, that they don't matter? Well, they're attached to other rights. That you're a citizen, the right of citizen, the rights of tenants, the rights of property owners, for that matter. You know, can somebody tell me that you know, if I own a house, that I can't smoke in it? Can they do that? No, because there are property rights that my liberties are attached to. But their liberties are attached to tenants' rights too. It's just not as emphatically in our society, but it's still there. So,
Right.
So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about the quiet enjoyment.
Of course, they always say, well, the smoke goes through the walls and goes through the plumbing
Yeah,
and
it affects other people's rights
right,
too.
to quietly enjoy.
But then as my main point, that'll be my whole summary of this whole thing, is the distinction between the so-called science and people's experience.
Yes.
Individual residents who back smoking bans seldom refer to science. They refer to their child with asthma and the person next door who smokes so heavily that they can smell the smoke in their
Yes,
apartment.
right.
That's not the same as the science that says no matter how small the amount is, it's not
Right.
safe.
Right.
But
right.
then there is this term that they have, the background quantity, right? That's what their justification is for the 25-foot limit.
Yeah,
They
yeah.
say, well, our scientifically we've found that at 23 feet from the source of somebody smoking,
Right.
it begins to become indistinguishable from the background, which is always there,
Yeah.
of things that Helfer is always exhaling smoke.
Well, you know,
particles,
it's kind of
and they're
interesting
everywhere.
because, you know, there's a smokers' rights advocate, I don't know if he calls himself that, but perhaps he does, named Michael McFadden, who,
Michael McFadden.
and he sometimes watches the show, and, you know, if you start looking at the science as you did and Cheryl did in Cambridge, the Alliance of Cambridge Tenants.
Yes,
Alliance of Cambridge Tenants, is that it?
that's it. ACT, A-C-T.
Okay, right. I don't know why that acronym sometimes,
Unfortunately, it's a very common acronym, and I'm sorry that we chose it.
I think it's a good
I
acronym,
think
but
CAT would be better.
cat.
Cambridge Alliance of Tenants, because not very many,
You're right.
not many
right.
groups call it
Cat.
CAT.
That would be
Yeah,
interesting,
yeah.
and then you could have a picture of like a panther.
Absolutely,
Of a
panther, right.
Right.
Right,
You know.
right. A rainbow panther, though, not a black one.
Absolutely, of
Rainbow
course,
panther.
of course. And because I remember in my high school, we had a panther, I think, in our yearbook, or I don't know.
Was that what you called your team?
The Panthers? No, I can't remember what we called our team. But Michael McFadden, you know how, I don't know if you've heard it or not, but they like to say that there are 4,000 chemicals in secondhand smoke.
Right, 4,000 chemicals.
I've heard 7,000 too. In fact, even on CDC's website, in one place
Did
they
list
say
them all?
no, but in the CDC's website, in one place, and I printed this out, so if they change it on me, I still have it. But on
Clever
one part,
bastard.
what?
Clever
Aren't
bastard,
I?
yes. Yeah.
You know, but at one part on the CDC's website, they say that they're 3,000 or 4,000, and the other part they say they're 7,000. So
I caught a big fish. Big. Really
yeah,
big.
right. But Michael McFadden has, you know, somewhere else on some authoritative scientific website, it says if you exhale, like if you exhale,
I do that.
could
too.
you do
I
it?
do.
Could you do it just for a moment? Just say.
Again?
Okay. But if you exhale, there are 3,000 chemicals in your exhalation.
You know why?
Why?
Because I breathe your
because you
your secondhand
yeah,
stuff.
well, no.
I mean, now I'm breathing.
well
it out.
actually you are actually being exposed to the third hand smoke.
To the third-hand smoke.
Yeah, because I smoke.
I know
and
that.
there are gases that cling to my clothing.
I know
and I am
gases.
off gassing. I'm off gassing. And you are.
Oh, I live.
Well, that's-
we're in Beantown.
That's
You know?
third hand smoke.
Yeah, I know about it. I know about third-hand.
And then.
And then fourth hand.
Well, I like what fourth hand smoke is. Well, fourth hand smoke is actually might be a good segue. I don't know, but they're always trying. There've been organizations that have been trying to eliminate smoking from movies.
You mean from on the screen or
Yes,
in
on the
in
screen.
You can't
On the
smoke in
screen.
the movie theater anyway.
Well, on the screen.
Okay. Trying
And-
to eliminate it.
And for
So do
example,
they have to go over the old films and wipe them out?
well, I don't think they
Stalin
quite.
used to do stuff
no,
like that.
right? And I mean, for example, there is a museum in Britain devoted to Winston Churchill, and there was a bit of a dust-up because someone noticed that in one of the photos on a banner hanging outside the museum is an image of
He
Winston
didn't have a
Churchill.
cigar, did he?
He did not. It was taken from a photograph, but it was pointed out that the photograph had been airbrushed in
to
a
get rid
Winston
of the
Churchill
cigar.
museum. So, for example, Disney has had a policy of no smoking in its movies at all. But now they're purchasing Fox.
Yeah, I know Donald Duck never smoked.
Right, but you know, I think Popeye the Sailor Man smoked. Remember
Pipe,
he had a
all
pipe?
the pipe upside down.
He had
Yeah,
a pipe, right.
pipe.
So, and for example, Disney made, somebody made a movie that was a biopic of Walt Disney.
But Disney was a smoker.
He was a smoker, but the Disney Corporation said that they would be happy to cooperate in every way. The only thing that they would not cooperate if there was any image of Disney smoking. So it's kind of funny because, well,
By the way, that does remind me, you know, when they're in comic books,
Right.
Disney comic books, there were smokers. It was when you ran across a bunch of thugs, you know, the dogs with the striped shirts, you know, with clenched teeth, you know, their
They have a
feet,
cigar
they,
in their
they have
mouth.
cigarettes and stuff in their mouth.
cigar in their mouth, yeah.
Yeah, cigars and cigarettes, yeah.
So, I don't know, I guess, so that Disney now is purchasing Fox or something like that, and it becomes questionable because a lot of these Fox movies are kind of edgier than Disney movies. And,
Yeah, well.
Well, of course, that's what I'm saying, that's fourth-hand smoke. In other words, when a youth sees smoking depicted in a movie, and then he has to run out and buy a package of
And there's the
cigarettes.
candy cigarettes too.
Those have, I don't know, those are, the
They're
world,
banned in many places.
I know, the World Health, well, the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, which is a World Health Organization global treaty, I think has banned those.
In a global treaty, they've banned
There is a
candy
there is a
cigarettes?
convention called the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, which is a worldwide treaty.
When did this get signed?
Oh gosh, it's got to be about 12 or 13 years ago.
Okay.
And I think 180 nations have signed on to it. And I believe it bans any kind of, candy cigarette or, yeah, that's something that,
How about candy vape candy vape machines?
well, remember they used to have bubble gum that looked like cigars?
Yeah, I remember those. God, they didn't really convince me because they were pink.
And then I was a kid, I remember we used to get these paper cigarettes that had no tobacco in them. And
Really?
yeah, they were kind of paper, they were for kids, and if you blew on them, like
Smoke would come out.
well, it wouldn't be really smoke, it would be like talcum powder.
But it's your vapor. You can go like this. You can go like.
Bill, I'm glad you really filled us in on this, but we only have 10 seconds
Oh,
left.
Jesus.
Thank you for coming on the show. I hope you'll come on again. And I'd like to say good night.
Good night.